Chapter 1. Introduction. The Ancient Dream of Flying. Since the dawn of human history, people have looked up at the sky and seen something that seemed unattainable to them, but yet had an irresistible fascination: flying. The birds, with their lightness, elegance, and freedom in the airspace, were a symbol of something that man could not do, but always longed for. The dream of flying is therefore not only a technical or scientific story, but also a cultural and emotional one. In myths, religions, works of art and legends, the desire to overcome gravity is deeply rooted. The history of aviation does not begin with the Wright brothers, the Montgolfiers, or the Zeppelins, but thousands of years earlier, in the realm of fantasy. If we look at the history of flying, it quickly becomes clear that it is not linear. Rather, it is an interplay between visions and setbacks, between progress and catastrophes. Many early experiments ended tragically because people had not yet understood the physical laws of aerodynamics. But without these pioneers, who were willing to risk their lives, the development of modern aviation would never have happened. It was the courage to compete against the obvious, gravity, that paved the way. The dream of flying is closely linked to the human urge to cross borders. Flying means rising above the earth, overcoming distances, and expanding one's horizons. For many cultures, it was also a spiritual symbol. Gods and supernatural beings were often depicted with wings, whether in Egyptian mythology, in the Christian idea of angels, or in the tales of indigenous peoples. Flying stood for power, freedom, and transcendence. It was a privilege of the gods and animals that was denied to humans, until he began to fight for it himself. In ancient times, philosophers such as Aristotle or Archimedes tried to explain the movements of birds, while craftsmen and tinkerers tried to build simple flying machines. These early attempts may have seemed naive, but they testify to an unbroken curiosity. In the Middle Ages, scholars such as Roger Bacon or later Leonardo da Vinci took up the ideas again, drew flying machines, and studied the mechanics of nature. The fact that many of these designs did not rise into the air does not diminish their importance. They were building blocks in a long development that was to bear fruit centuries later. The fascination for flying was always accompanied by a mixture of awe and fear. Anyone who tried to build wings risked not only their lives, but also ridicule and rejection. The legend of Icarus flying too close to the sun and crashing is more than just a myth. It is a symbol of the dangers of human ambition, which aims too high and fails at its own limits. But at the same time, it is also an inspiration. Without Icarus, there would be no progress, because only those who dare can achieve something new. The dream of flying has always been a collective dream. While individuals tried to realize it with their constructions, poets, painters, and philosophers spoke of the longing to leave the earth. Long before the technical realization, the idea of flying was omnipresent in people's minds. Think of fairy tales of the flying carpet, medieval ideas of witches riding through the air on brooms, or reports of shamans traveling through the sky in their trances. Flying was therefore not only a technical challenge, but also an integral part of human culture. The beginning of modern aviation history was marked by a shift. Dreams became concrete experiments, and legends became science. With the rise of the natural sciences in the Renaissance, air, buoyancy, and currents began to be systematically investigated. Experiments with hot air, with sails, and later with gases led to the first successes. But it was not until the 18th century that the Montgolfier brothers took a man into the air with their hot air balloon, a moment that made mankind realize that the sky was no longer reserved for birds and gods alone. Aviation developed in the 19th and 20th centuries at a speed that was breathtaking. No sooner had the balloon been invented than the development of airships followed. The Wright brothers had hardly completed their powered flight when aircraft were improved at a rapid pace, made faster, larger, and more powerful. Within a few decades, flying changed from a life-threatening test of courage to an everyday reality. Humans were suddenly able to cross continents, wage wars with air forces, and later even travel into space. But this introduction should not give the impression that the history of flying is a pure success story. Every progress was accompanied by tragedies, setbacks, and doubts. Balloonists crashed, airships exploded, aviation pioneers died during test flights. Aviation has always been a risky undertaking, and even today, despite all safety standards, it is not free of dangers. But it is precisely this risky character that makes it such an impressive chapter in human history. The history of aviation is also a mirror of social developments. It shows how closely technology and politics, science, and culture are interwoven. Flying became a symbol of progress, of modernity, but also of power. Militarily, it was used to overwhelm enemies, and civilianly, it was used to bring people and cultures closer together. Aviation was and is a field in which the ambivalences of human action are particularly evident. It connects and destroys, it opens up new horizons, and at the same time threatens environmental pollution. This introduction is intended to make it clear that the history of aviation is not to be understood solely as a technical chronology. It is a story of longings and visions, of courage and failure, of people who were willing to risk their lives to cross a border that until then seemed insurmountable. It is also a story of the collective dream that has persisted in myths, religions, and art for thousands of years and finally became reality through science and technology. So as we progress through the coming chapters, we will not only look at aircraft, engines, and records, but also at the people behind them, their motivations, their fears and hopes. Because without the age-old dream of flying, no machine would have been built, and without the longing for freedom and overcoming borders, aviation would not have become what it is today. For a long time, heaven was an insurmountable space for humans, until they found the courage to conquer it. Chapter 2: Myths and Legends, Icarus, Flying Carpets and Journeys to the Sky. Before people understood the physical laws of lift, flow, and aerodynamics, before balloons, airships or aeroplanes were even conceivable, the dream of flying existed mainly in stories, myths, and legends. These early stories are a fascinating window into the human longing to leave the earth and rise into the sphere of gods, spirits, or natural forces. The myths of flying are not simply naive fantasies, but cultural reflections of freedom, power, and the desire to cross borders. They have accompanied people for thousands of years and often inspired the imagination of inventors, poets, and inventors. One of the most famous stories is the Greek legend of Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus, the great inventor and builder, is said to have built wings of feathers and wax for himself and his son in order to escape from the captivity of King Minos on Crete. While the father remained cautious, Icarus became cocky, climbed too high, too close to the sun, so that the wax melted and he fell into the sea. This story is more than an adventure. It is a warning against arrogance, a symbol of the dangers of human hubris when you want to go too far, too high. But at the same time, it is also a symbol of courage and longing. Because without the desire to push the boundaries of what is possible, like Icarus, there would have been no technical development. We find similar ideas in many cultures. In Norse mythology, for example, there are Valkyries who ride through the air and bring fallen warriors to Valhalla. In India, ancient writings tell of flying chariots, the Vimanas, which were used by gods and heroes. These Vimanas are described in detail, with seats, switches, and even weapons, descriptions that some interpret as evidence of an early idea of flying machines. Whether fantasy or projection, they show that the dream of flying was universal. In the Arab world, on the other hand, the legend of the flying carpet emerged. He plays an important role especially in the stories from 1001 Nights. The flying carpet is a symbol of freedom and unlimited movement, for an effortless journey through time and space. Whoever owns it can escape, travel, or gain power. It is not surprising that the idea of such a means of transport was particularly popular in the Orient, with its endless deserts and great distances. The carpet, an everyday commodity, becomes a marvel in the imagination that overcomes gravity and space. The motif of flying can also be found in biblical and religious traditions. In the Old Testament, the prophet Elijah is carried to heaven on a chariot of fire, and in the New Testament, angels appear as messengers of God with wings that connect heaven and earth. Flying was a divine privilege here, an expression of a closeness to the transcendent. The Christian idea of the angel hovering over the earth shaped the image of flying for centuries. In the Middle Ages, at a time when religion and magic were often intertwined, tales of flying were often linked to witchcraft. Witches are said to have ridden through the night on brooms. Demons could supposedly travel through the air. This is where the ambivalence of flying becomes apparent. On the one hand, it was a symbol of divine power. On the other hand, it was associated with the devilish. Anyone who claimed to be able to fly risked being persecuted as a heretic or witch. Flying was therefore not only a longing, but also a dangerous crossing of boundaries. It is interesting to note that many of these myths have a double character. On the one hand, they tell of freedom, of the possibility of leaving the earth, and on the other hand, they warn of the dangers of this freedom. Icarus falls, witches are burned, even heroes risk their lives when they enter heaven. Flying was a temptation, but also a taboo break. Heaven was divine, and those who entered it questioned the order. Perhaps this explains why early inventors and aviation pioneers were so often regarded as eccentrics, as people who tried something forbidden. In addition to the religious and mythical tales, there are also numerous fairy tales and folk stories in which the motif of flying appears. In Eastern European fairy tales, heroes fly on huge birds or dragons. In African myth, shamans can cross the air. In the Mongolian tradition, spirits ride through the sky on winged horses. These stories often have a moral or spiritual dimension. Those who can fly have special powers, but also special responsibility. The symbolism of flying was so strong in many cultures that it was taken up again and again in art, architecture, and literature. Cathedrals, with their pointed towers and floating arches, are an architectural expression of the desire to reach heaven. Paintings from the Renaissance show angels and saints in flight, while in poetry the image of the bird or the feather repeatedly serves as a metaphor for freedom and longing. The fact that the dream of flying was not only a game of fantasy, but also inspired concrete experiments is shown in early reports by courageous inventors. As early as the early Middle Ages, there are said to have been people who built wings out of wood and fabric and jumped from towers, often with fatal outcomes. Even if these stories are not always historically proven, they reflect the urge to turn myths into reality. One could say that the myths and legends prepared the ground for later scientific experiments. They kept the dream alive, gave it shape and images that inventors could use as a guide. Those who built a balloon may have thought of the flying carpet. Those who constructed wings remembered Icarus. The cultural memory of flying acted as an engine for the imagination, and without imagination there is no progress. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the myths about flying are universal. They appear independently of each other in a wide variety of cultures, which shows that the longing to conquer the sky is deeply anchored in human consciousness. It is an archetypal dream, comparable to the desire for immortality or limitless power. Flying has always been more than just a means of transport. It was and is a symbol of crossing boundaries, be they physical, mental, or spiritual. Before we devote ourselves to concrete inventions and scientific discoveries in the next chapters, it is important to understand this cultural background. After all, aviation history is not only a history of technology and progress, but also of myths, symbols, and longings. The images of Icarus, of angels, of flying carpets accompany us to this day. They are part of our collective memory and remind us that the dream of flying was always a dream before it became a reality. Chapter 3: First Experiments in Antiquity, Mechanics and Aerodynamics. Antiquity is often considered the cradle of many technical achievements that would not unfold their full effect until centuries later. In the history of aviation, too, we find the first systematic considerations, experiments, and constructions in this epoch that point to an understanding of the mechanics of flight. Although mankind was still a long way from understanding the principles of aerodynamics as they are taken for granted in engineering today, the ancient thinkers and inventors laid the foundations. Their observations and imagination were a first step towards leading the age-old dream of flying from the realm of myths into the field of practical experiments. One name that is inevitably associated with the beginnings is Icarus of Taranto, a Greek philosopher, mathematician, and inventor from the 4th century BC. It is said that he built a wooden bird that flew by being set in motion by a hidden mechanism, presumably by compressed air or a tensioned rope. Even though this device could probably only cover short distances and was hardly comparable to real flying in the modern sense, it shows that even then attempts were made to imitate the movements of birds and to find technical solutions. Icarus' dove is perhaps the first documented model of a flying machine in history. Another important name is Archimedes, the great mathematician and physicist of the 3rd century BC. Although he did not deal directly with flying machines, his investigations into lift in liquids later influenced the understanding of air as a medium. Archimedes realized that bodies float or sink in water according to certain laws, depending on the density ratio. If these findings are transferred to the air, the idea arises that gases can also generate buoyancy. This idea would form the basis for hot air balloons and airships many centuries later. Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BC, also devoted himself to the movements of birds and the air. In his essay on the animals, he describes how birds are carried by wing beats and gliding movements. Although he misinterpreted many observations because he lacked a modern understanding of fluid mechanics, his considerations show that natural phenomena began to be studied systematically at an early age. For Aristotle, air was an element that could generate resistance and lift at the same time, and in doing so, he approached the first aerodynamic concepts. In addition to theoretical considerations, there were also practical attempts to build flying machines in antiquity. Reports from China tell of dragons that were used more than 2,000 years ago as toys, but also for military purposes. These kites were the first man-made objects that actually floated in the air, carried by the wind. Even though they were not intended to transport people, they are important precursors because they showed that fabric and wood can be carried in the right combination of air currents. In Greece and Rome, inventors also experimented with simple gliders. The myth of Daedalus and Icarus, even if it probably had no real basis, could have been inspired by such early experiments. There are reports of men who built wings out of wooden feathers and jumped from towers or hills. Whether these experiments really took place or are rather legends remains open. What is clear, however, is that the idea of flying with mechanical wings was firmly anchored in the ancient imagination. The mechanics played a central role in this. Ancient scholars already had a considerable knowledge of levers, rollers, gears, and pneumatics. In the 1st century AD, the Alexandrian engineer Heron developed various machines, including the so-called eolipile, a type of steam ball that was set in rotation by the expulsion of water vapor. This device is considered the first known steam engine and shows that antiquity experimented with energy sources, which later also became important for the propulsion of flying machines. Although Heron probably did not think of building an aeroplane with this technique, His inventions made it clear that motion could be generated by pressure and flow. The idea of flying was also strongly present culturally in antiquity. Plays in which gods seemed to float down from the sky with mechanical devices used early-stage technology that amazed audiences. These so-called deus ex machina apparatuses were not real flying machines, but rope hoists and cranes, but they helped to anchor the image of man in the air. Another aspect is the connection between astronomy and flying. In ancient times, celestial observations were a central field of science, and looking at the stars awakened the idea that one could travel not only to the air, but also to the sky itself. For many cultures, heaven was the dwelling place of the gods, and the thought of reaching it had not only a technical but also a spiritual dimension. In China, not only kites have been handed down, but also the first reports of experiments with gliders. According to legend, a man named Yuan Huangqiu was forced to jump from a tower with wings in the 6th century AD. He allegedly survived because he sailed with the improvised wings. Even if such reports are difficult to verify, they show that people repeatedly tried to test flying in practice. So antiquity did not produce successful flying machines, but it laid the intellectual and experimental foundations. It showed that air was not just emptiness, but a medium with properties that could be used. She combined the dream of flying with the first technical models, be it the wooden dove of Archytas or the dragons in China. It produced scholars who studied the movements of nature and derived hypotheses from them. And she created cultural images of flying that were to last for thousands of years. When we look back on these early attempts today, many things may seem imperfect. But it would be a mistake to regard antiquity as merely naive or technically incompetent. Without the observations of Aristotle, without the experiments of Heron, without the inspirations from myths and plays, later generations would have had fewer starting points to continue their research. The ancient world was the first great resonance chamber in which the dream of flying was cast in concrete forms. Antiquity thus marks a decisive starting point in the long history of aviation. She showed that the dream did not only exist in myths, but that it could approach reality through experiments and technology. Even though this reality was still distant, the first step had been taken. Humans began to understand air as a space for technology, and thus the sky as a possible stage for their own inventions. Chapter 4: Medieval Flight Dreams, Leonardo da Vinci and the Flying Machines. The Middle Ages and the early modern period were marked by a field of tension that decisively influenced the history of flying. On the one hand, the deep belief in religious worldviews, which often regarded the crossing of divine boundaries as presumptuous, and on the other hand, the growing urge of scholars, craftsmen, and artists to systematically study nature and seek new technical solutions. In this era, the dream of flying began to increasingly detach itself from myths and penetrate into the sphere of science and technology. Especially with Leonardo da Vinci, this process reached a climax that radiated far beyond his time. As early as the High Middle Ages, there were isolated reports of people who dared to take to the air with self-made wings. These early flight attempts were mostly rudimentary and often ended tragically. One of the most famous cases is the English monk Alma of Malmesbury, who jumped from a church tower in the 11th century after building wings out of wood and fabric. He allegedly sailed a few hundred meters before he crashed and seriously injured himself. Even though he did not survive the flight, history shows that the idea of gliding was already present at that time. Such attempts are evidence that the people of the Middle Ages were not just dreaming of myths, but were willing to risk their lives to get closer to heaven. However, most of these early attempts failed because there was no understanding of the physical principles of flight. Aerodynamics, airflow, and lift were unknown concepts, and the designs were based on observations of birds rather than scientific calculations. Nevertheless, these daring jumps laid an important foundation. They showed that people were seriously trying to put the dream of flying into practice. A decisive turning point came with the Renaissance. This epoch was marked by a return to ancient knowledge, but also by a new spirit of research. Artists and scholars began to study natural phenomena more closely, to sketch them, to analyze them, and to question them systematically. It was in this environment that Leonardo da Vinci emerged, whose work on flying is still considered visionary today. Leonardo da Vinci, born in 1452 in Vinci near Florence, was not only a painter and sculptor, but also a passionate researcher and engineer. In his famous notebooks, which contain thousands of drawings and commentaries, he devoted himself intensively to the dream of flying. Unlike many of his predecessors, Leonardo tried to scientifically record the movements of birds. He observed their wings, their gliding movements, and the way they used air currents. In the process, he made detailed drawings that still impress today. His flying machine designs are fascinating evidence of the connection between art and science. Da Vinci designed various apparatuses, including ornithopters, devices with movable wings that were to be powered by human muscle power. His drawings show constructions made of wood, fabric, and ropes that are modeled on a huge bird or bat. Even though they never worked practically because the human body cannot muster enough force, they were the expression of a new, systematic approach. Leonardo's concept of a precursor to the helicopter is particularly remarkable. In his sketches there is an air screw, a spiral construction made of reeds, lines, and wire, which was supposed to spiral into the air by turning. Even though it was technically impossible to realize this idea with the means of the time, it shows that Leonardo recognized principles that were implemented centuries later in real aircraft. His ability to translate nature observation into technical visions made him a forerunner of modern engineers. In addition, Leonardo worked on gliders that come close to the principle of the modern glider. He sketched areas that should use the lift and realized that large wings carry better than small ones. In some of his drawings, it is clear that he had an idea of flow conditions, even if he was not yet able to grasp the underlying laws mathematically. His notes contain notes on air pressure and the role of the wind, which later became central to aerodynamics. Leonardo da Vinci, however, was a man of his time. His designs remained largely theoretical, as he had no opportunity to put them into practice. The materials were too heavy, the human muscle power too weak, the physical calculations too imprecise. Many of his sketches were never built, and the few attempts he may have made were unsuccessful. Nevertheless, his contribution to the history of aviation was invaluable. He opened the door to a new way of thinking that no longer saw flying as a divine privilege or magical miracle, but as a technical challenge to be solved with observation and science. In addition to Leonardo, there were also other thinkers in the Middle Ages who thought about flying. In the 13th century, the English scholar Roger Bacon wrote of possible flying machines that could be powered by engines or springs. Arab scholars such as Abbas ibn Firnas are also said to have made flight attempts, which are handed down in legends. All these examples show that the idea of flying remained alive in different cultures, even if it did not yet lead to practical implementation. The medieval dreams of flying were characterized by a special mixture. They combined myths and religious ideas with growing technical knowledge. While flying was often considered witchcraft or divine miracle in popular culture, scholars and artists increasingly saw it as a feasible challenge. In this tension, a new horizon emerged, which prepared the ground for the later successes of the modern era. In retrospect, it can be said that Leonardo da Vinci is a symbol of this era. He embodied the Renaissance in its entirety: curiosity, artistry, the urge to cross borders. Even if his machines didn't take off, they still lifted the spirit. They showed that flying could not only be dreamed, but also planned, drawn, and thought. And in doing so, they laid the foundation for those pioneers who actually conquered the skies centuries later. Chapter 5. The invention of the hot air balloon, Montgolfier and the pioneers of ballooning. With the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Enlightenment, an era began in Europe that was characterized by a new trust in science and technology. Laws of nature should no longer be the subject of speculation and philosophical debate, but should be tested through experiments and put to practical use. It was in this climate that one of the greatest revolutions in the history of aviation was born: the invention of the hot air balloon. It was the first step that actually released man from the ground and allowed him to stay in the air for long periods of time. It was the birth of manned aviation, an event that deeply impressed not only science but also society. The key figures in this story were the brothers Joseph Michel and Joseph and Étienne Montgolfier, paper manufacturers from Annonay in France. They had been interested in physical experiments from an early age, and in 1782 they made a crucial observation. They noticed that a silk bag they were holding over a fire inflated and rose to the top. At first, they believed they had discovered a special substance that they called Montgolfier gas. In reality, it was heated air that created buoyancy due to its lower density. Without knowing it, they had discovered the principle of the hot air balloon. The brothers began to build larger models, and on June 4, 1783, they held a public demonstration in their hometown. A huge balloon of canvas and paper, heated by a fire, rose into the sky before the eyes of the amazed crowd. It was a spectacular sight that quickly drew attention all the way to Paris. There, the brothers repeated their experiments in front of a large audience and aroused the interest of the scientific academies and the nobility. The next step was the question: can living beings also be carried in such a balloon? On September 19, 1783, in Versailles, in the presence of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, the Montgolfiers launched a balloon with 3 passengers: a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. The balloon rose, stayed in the air for several minutes, and landed safely after a short journey. This successful experiment showed that living things could survive a balloon flight and paved the way for the first manned flight. On November 21, 1783, the time had finally come. In Paris, Jean-François Pilate de Rogy, a teacher, and the Marquis d'Arlens, a young nobleman, climbed into a balloon of the Montgolfiers. In front of a huge crowd of spectators, the balloon, driven by hot air, rose above the rooftops of Paris. They hovered over the city for about 25 minutes before landing safely. It was the first time in history that people with an aircraft remained free and controlled in the air. This moment marked the beginning of aviation in the true sense of the word. The enthusiasm was enormous. Newspapers reported throughout Europe, artists painted the scene, poets sang about the event. The dream of flying, which for thousands of years had existed only in myths and drawings, had become reality. At the same time, a race for new records and technical improvements began. Shortly after the Montgolfiers, other inventors appeared on the scene. Particularly important was Jacques-Alexandre César-Charles, a physicist who used hydrogen gas instead of hot air. On December 1, 1783, he and his assistant ascended in a hydrogen-filled balloon, a step that paved the way for gas balloons, which were soon more powerful and durable than hot air balloons. In the years that followed, the balloon rides became a social and scientific spectacle. In many cities in Europe, demonstrations took place in which balloons rose into the sky. Nobles, scholars, and adventurers vied to be part of this new technology. Balloon rides became a sign of progress, a demonstration of human genius and audacity. At the same time, they served science. For the first time, balloonists were able to carry out atmospheric investigations in higher air layers, measure temperature and air pressure, and look at the Earth from a completely new perspective. But the euphoria was not without its downsides. Balloon rides were risky. The balloons were difficult to steer because they were driven only by the wind, and fire, gas explosions, or rough landings repeatedly led to accidents. A particularly tragic event occurred in 1785, when Pilate de Rogy, the first manned balloonist, was killed while trying to cross the English Channel in a hybrid balloon of hot air and hydrogen. Nevertheless, this did not stop the development. In the decades following the invention, balloons were increasingly used for practical purposes. In the 19th century, it was used for scientific high-altitude research, but also for military purposes. During the Revolutionary Wars and later in the Franco-German War of 1870, balloons were used for reconnaissance and communication. In Paris, messages and people were smuggled out of the city in balloons during the siege. Balloons were thus not only technical marvels, but also tools of strategic importance. The fascination of the public did not diminish either. Balloonists became veritable folk heroes, adventurers who reached new heights with courage and skill. Show flights took place in many cities, attracting thousands. Balloon rides inspired writers such as Jules Verne, who in his novel 5 Weeks in a Balloon dealt with the adventure of traveling through the air in literature. The invention of the hot air balloon was a milestone because it marked the transition from dream and theory to practice. For the first time, humans were able to rise into the air in a controlled manner and look at the Earth from above. Although controllability was limited, the realization that humans could hover and fly was a revolution. The sky was no longer just the realm of birds or gods, it was a space that humans could also conquer. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the Montgolfier brothers were not only inventors, but also symbolic figures of an era. They stood for the spirit of the Enlightenment, which believed in the power of experiments and reason. Their balloon was not just a technical device, but a manifesto. With knowledge and courage, man could cross boundaries that previously seemed insurmountable. This was the first big step. The balloon ushered in the age of aviation, even if it would take another century for motorized aircraft to dominate the sky. He was the bridge between myths and modern technology, between dreams and science. The Montgolfiers had opened the sky, and humanity would never lose sight of it again. Chapter 6: Airships and the Dream of Controllable Aviation. After the Montgolfier brothers had made the first manned ascent possible with their hot air balloon in 1783, it was clear that man could conquer the air. But as spectacular as this invention was, it had a crucial weakness: balloons could not really be controlled. They drifted with the wind, could only rise or fall by warming or cooling, but could not change their course. Thus, the dream of flying remained tangible, but still incomplete. What was missing was the ability to steer aviation in a targeted direction. This is exactly where the idea of the airship came in, a balloon that could not only ascend, but also navigate through the air like a ship. The idea of a controllable balloon occupied tinkerers shortly after the first successful balloon flights. As early as the end of the 18th century, inventors were drawing up plans for elongated, cigar-shaped balloons that offered less resistance than spherical ones. They experimented with rudders, sails, and later with propellers to influence the direction. But the technical means were initially inadequate. Muscle power or simple mechanisms could hardly counter the power of the wind. It was not until the development of more powerful engines in the 19th century that the vision of the airship became realistic. One of the early pioneers was the Frenchman Henri Giffard. In 1852, he built a spindle-shaped airship with a small steam engine drive. His gas balloon was about 44 meters long, and the machine drove a propeller. Giffard actually undertook a journey of about 27 kilometers near Paris and was able to show that an airship could be maneuvered against the wind. Although the engine was still weak and the ship heavy, it was the first proof that controllability was possible. Giffard's flight is considered the birth of the airship age. In the decades that followed, numerous inventors tried to develop his idea further. The next big advance came with the use of internal combustion engines. Otto Lilienthal and other researchers worked in parallel on gliding and aerodynamics, while airship builders used engine technology to make their ships more powerful. Especially in France and Germany, new constructions were created in the second half of the 19th century, which could cover ever greater distances. However, the decisive breakthrough was achieved by a man whose name is inextricably linked with the history of airships, Ferdinand Graf von Zeppelin. The Württemberg officer had become acquainted with balloon rides during his military service in the USA and was fascinated by the idea of building a controllable airship. From the 1890s onwards, he devoted himself to this vision with enormous ambition and perseverance. Zeppelin developed rigid airships in which the gas did not simply float in a shell, but was carried by an aluminium framework. This design allowed for much larger ships that were more stable and controllable than anything that had existed before. In 1900, the first Zeppelin airship, the LZ-1, took to the skies from Lake Constance. Although the journey was still accompanied by technical problems, the principle had proven itself. In the following years, Zeppelin developed ever larger and more reliable ships. His designs reached speeds of over 100 kilometers per hour, could transport dozens of passengers and cover long distances. Soon, the Zeppelins became symbols of progress and national pride in Germany. At the beginning of the 20th century, airships were the most modern form of aviation. Even before the Wright brothers' first successful powered flights, they dominated the idea of how humans would conquer the sky. The elegant shape of the Zeppelins, their majestic flights, and their ability to navigate in a targeted manner made them an engineering marvel. Soon they were used not only for shovel flights, but also for scheduled services. In 1910, the Deutsche Luftschiffahrtsgesellschaft DLAG was founded, the first commercial airline in the world to offer regular passenger flights with Zeppelins. The states also quickly recognized the value of this new technology militarily. During the First World War, airships were used by Germany as well as by Great Britain and France. Zeppelins served as reconnaissance aircraft, but also as bomb platforms. The German airships in particular caused a stir when they flew attacks on London and other cities. Although they were vulnerable to air defense and weather, they showed that aviation opened up a new dimension of warfare. After the war, a new heyday of airship began, especially in the 1920s and early 1930s. Huge ships such as the Graf Zeppelin or later the Hindenburg connected continents and made luxurious journeys possible that would have taken weeks with ships. The Graf Zeppelin undertook spectacular world trips, flew over the Atlantic and the Arctic and proved that airships were capable of intercontinental traffic. For many people, a ride in the Zeppelin was the ultimate in elegance and technical modernity. But the fascination was not without risk. Airships were dependent on gas fillings, usually hydrogen, which was highly flammable. Helium would have been safer, but it was difficult to obtain. This vulnerability repeatedly led to accidents that shook confidence in technology. The most tragic incident occurred on May 6, 1937, when the Hindenburg exploded in Lakehurst, New Jersey, during landing. 36 people died, and the images of the burning airship disaster went around the world. This event symbolically marked the end of the great era of Zeppelins. Nevertheless, the importance of airships should not be underestimated. They were the first real means of transport in the skies that could transport people over long distances and with plannable routes. They combined technology, adventure, and luxury in a unique way, creating an atmosphere that gave aviation a glamorous face. Even though they were displaced by the faster and more reliable aircraft, they were an indispensable step in development. Today, airships are experiencing a renaissance on a smaller scale. Modern Zeppelin NTs are used for advertising, tourism, or scientific purposes. Filled with helium, they are safer and offer smooth flights with fantastic views. They are reminiscent of an era when the sky was still ruled by huge, silent giants that flew through the air like floating cathedrals. In retrospect, it can be seen that the airships marked the decisive transition. They led people from pure ascent in a balloon to controlled locomotion in the air. They were the first real aircraft to open up the sky as a traffic space. Even though their time was limited, they shaped people's imaginations and proved that the vision of the controllable aircraft could become a reality. Without the experience of airships, the road to modern aviation would probably have been much longer. Chapter 7. The Birth of Powered Flight, the Wright Brothers. At the beginning of the 20th century, the dream of flying was no longer just a topic of myths, balloon experiments, and airships. Many tinkerers around the world worked intensively to build a machine that was heavier than air and yet could fly in a controlled manner. It had long been recognized that humans could not take off with wings alone, and balloons had also shown their limits. The goal was clear: an aircraft with an engine that could not only climb, but also maneuver and land. Many pioneers, such as Otto Lilienthal in Germany and Octave Chanute in the United States, had done important groundwork, But it was two brothers from Dayton, Ohio, who finally accomplished this decisive step, Orville and Wilbur Wright. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics by trade, but their passion was technology and invention. Even as children they had played with gliding kites, and the fascination for flying never left them. At the end of the 19th century, they began to systematically deal with the problem. Their approach was remarkably pragmatic. They saw flying not only as a question of engine power, but as a complex interplay of aerodynamics, control, and propulsion. It was precisely in this comprehensive understanding that they differed from many of their contemporaries, who relied primarily on engines that were as powerful as possible. A decisive influence came from Otto Lilienthal, the German aviation pioneer who had caused an international sensation with his gliding flights in the 1890s. Lilienthal had shown that it was possible to glide through the air with wings built. However, he had died in 1896 during an attempt to fly. The Wrights studied his work intensively and realized that the key was not only in buoyancy, but above all in the steering. An aircraft not only had to fly, but also remain stable and be able to be steered in a targeted manner. From 1899 onwards, the brothers began their own experiments. They built kite models with which they tested various control techniques. Their central concept was a twisting of the wings, a method in which the wing tips are twisted against each other to control the rolling motion. This principle, which was later replaced by ailerons, was a revolutionary step, as it enabled precise control of the aircraft in all three axes, roll, pitch and yaw, for the first time. In 1900, the Wrights traveled to Kitty Hawk, a remote area of North Carolina with strong winds and soft sand dunes that offered ideal conditions for flight attempts. There they tested their first gliders that did not yet have an engine. Over several years, they improved their designs, carried out countless test flights and gained valuable experience. In the process, they also built their own wind tunnel to systematically examine wing profiles, a step that shows how scientifically they proceeded. In 1903, the time had finally come. The Wrights designed an aircraft with its own engine. Since there was no suitable engine on the market, they built it themselves together with their mechanic Charlie Taylor. The four-cylinder engine produced around 12 horsepower and drove two wooden propellers, which were also developed by the brothers. On December 17, 1903, Orville Wright launched the first motorized flight in history. The plane, the Flyer I, took off in Kitty Hawk, flew for 12 seconds and covered 36 meters before landing again. 3 more flights followed, the longest over 260 meters in 59 seconds. This was the first controlled, motorized flight of a heavier-than-air device. This date marks one of the greatest turning points in the history of technology. Even though the flights were still short and wobbly, the Wrights had proven that controlled flying was possible. However, the reactions to this success were initially restrained. Many newspapers did not report at all or only skeptically, as spectacular pictures were expected and the Wrights' flight still seemed inconspicuous. It was not until the following years, as the brothers continued to improve their technology, that the realization prevailed that a new era had indeed begun. In the years after 1903, the Wrights continued to develop their aircraft. As early as 1905, they were able to carry out flights of more than 30 minutes and fly circles. They applied for patents and began to market their invention both military and civilian. In Europe, especially in France, their demonstrations met with great interest from 1908 onwards. Other pioneers such as Louis Blériot and Alberto Santos Dumont also found inspiration there to develop their own aircraft. The importance of the Wrights lies not only in the fact that they were the first to take off with an engine. Their comprehensive approach was crucial. They understood that an aircraft had to solve 3 problems: lift, propulsion, and control. While many tinkerers only worked on one of these problems, the Wrights brought all 3 together. Their systematic experiments, their wind tunnel, and their scientific methodology made them engineers in the modern sense. However, the birth of powered flight was not an end, but a beginning. In the following years, the development of aviation literally exploded. Numerous nations founded flying clubs, held competitions, and promoted the technology. The Wright brothers were the pioneers who opened the gate, but they were soon overtaken by a whole generation of inventors and pilots who built on their achievements. Nevertheless, the 17th of December, 1903 remains a date of historic significance. It was a moment when man finally proved that he could not only drift with the wind or glide like a sailor, but fly under his own power. Heaven was no longer out of reach. In retrospect, it is clear that the Wrights accomplished their work from a mixture of craftsmanship, scientific curiosity, and unwavering perseverance. They were not rich industrialists or university scholars, but simple mechanics who, with courage, intelligence, and creativity, solved one of the greatest problems in human history. Her example shows that progress often comes from people who work beyond established institutions, but pursue their vision with passion and discipline. The Wright brothers didn't just build an aeroplane, they ushered in a new era. Their Flyer I was the forefather of all modern aircraft, the starting point for development that within a few decades led from the first hop over the beach of Kitty Hawk to intercontinental passenger flights and rocket launches into space. Chapter 8. Early Pioneers in Europe, Blériot, Santos Dumont, and others. While the Wright brothers carried out their first successful powered flights in the United States and laid the foundations for modern aircraft construction, aviation quickly picked up speed in Europe as well. There was great public interest in spectacular technical innovations, and the atmosphere was characterized by national pride, scientific curiosity, and the spirit of competition. France, Great Britain, Germany, and Italy became centers of early aviation pioneering work, and a number of personalities emerged who drove the development of the aircraft forward with courage, inventiveness, and often a penchant for risk. One of the most famous names of the time is Louis Blériot, a French engineer and entrepreneur. Blériot had originally experimented with automobiles before turning to aircraft construction. His first attempts were marked by setbacks, accidents, and financial losses, but he was not discouraged. Blériot was convinced that the future of aviation lay in light, motorized machines that could be controlled by a pilot. His breakthrough came with the Blériot 11, a single-seater monoplane that had a simple but robust design. This aircraft would go down in history when Blériot became the first person to cross the English Channel on July 25, 1909. The flight from Calais to Dover took around 37 minutes and made Blériot an international hero overnight. Newspapers all over Europe reported on his achievement, and he was celebrated as proof that the aeroplane was not just a toy for tinkerers, but a serious means of transport that could cross borders. This flight had not only technical but also symbolic significance. It showed that the sky was no longer a barrier between nations, but a space that could connect them, or, as many feared at the same time, a new front line for possible wars. In addition to Blériot, another pioneer emerged whose life and work shaped early aviation: Alberto Santos Dumont. The inventor, who was born in Brazil and lives in Paris, had first experimented with airships and won the German prize in 1901 by flying a motorized airship from Parc Saint-Cloud to the Eiffel Tower and back. This event made him a celebrity in Paris, because it proved that controlled flights with airships were possible. But Santos Dumont did not limit herself to balloons. He soon turned to heavier-than-air machines and in 1906 designed the 14 bis, a bizarre-looking aircraft with box-shaped wings and a tail unit. On October 23, 1906, he succeeded in a flight of 60 meters in length in Paris, which took place in front of numerous witnesses and is considered the first officially recognized powered flight in Europe. While the Wright's flights were still viewed skeptically in the USA and remained without broad public recognition for a long time, Santos Dumont's flight was a media event. He was celebrated because he did not work in secret, but publicly demonstrated his experiments. Santos Dumont was charismatic, wealthy, and media effective, qualities that made him a key figure in early aviation. In addition to these big names, there were a large number of other pioneers who experimented with a wide variety of ideas. Henri Farman, a Briton working in France, developed successful biplanes that set records in competitions. In 1908, he managed to complete a closed sightseeing flight over 1 kilometer, which was considered a sensation at the time. His machines were more reliable than many competing models and also attracted military interest. Farman was not only a pilot, but also an entrepreneur who sold his aircraft to others and thus contributed to the spread of the technology. In Germany, it was above all August Euler who was one of the first German pilots and aircraft builders to emerge. He built his own models, founded flight schools, and advocated the military use of aircraft. The Voisin brothers in France also played an important role. They constructed biplanes that were used by numerous pioneers, including the Wrights in their demonstrations in Europe. Their workshop in Issy-les-Moulineaux near Paris was a center of early flight development and produced many important designs. The years between 1905 and 1914 were a time of experimentation, records, and spectacular competitions. Numerous competitions were held in which prize money was offered for certain achievements, for example, for crossing the English Channel, for long-haul flights, or for speed. These competitions were engines of progress because they spurred pioneers to improve their machines. At the same time, they attracted huge crowds of people who watched enthusiastically as brave pilots took to the air with fragile constructions. Aviation became a mass event that caused amazement and admiration. A lively aviation scene also began to develop in Italy. Giovanni Caproni and other engineers built early aircraft that would soon become part of military fleets. In Great Britain, Samuel Cody, originally an American showman, worked on biplanes and carried out spectacular demonstrations. Airfields, clubs, and training centers sprang up all over Europe, and within a few years a dense network of players developed to advance the technology. What united these early pioneers was not only their courage, but also their willingness to accept mistakes and setbacks. Crashes were frequent, and many lost their lives trying to control their machines. But each accident led to new insights, and step by step, the aircraft became more stable, more reliable, and more powerful. Progress was breathtakingly fast. There was less than a decade between 1903, when the Wrights covered just 36 meters, and 1909, when Blériot flew across the English Channel. The early pioneers of Europe made a decisive contribution to taking the aircraft out of the status of a curious invention and establishing it as a serious means of transport and military instrument. They made aviation visible, public, and popular. While the Wrights initially withheld their technology and wanted to protect it commercially, Santos-Dumont, Blériot, and others invited the public to participate. In doing so, they shaped the image of aviation as a spectacle and as a communal adventure. In retrospect, it is clear that without these early European pioneers, aviation history would have been slower. They brought technology to the public, inspired engineers and military alike, and proved that flying was not an American exclusivity, but a global phenomenon. Their achievements are part of an era that was carried by a spirit of optimism, technical euphoria, and unbridled pioneering spirit. Chapter 9. The First World War, Airplanes as a New Weapon. When the First World War broke out in the summer of 1914, aviation was only a decade old. Aeroplanes had set spectacular records, courageous pilots had flown over oceans and mountains, and audiences had been fascinated by air shows. But as a serious military instrument, the fragile machines were initially underestimated. Many generals saw it as a gimmick, perhaps useful for reconnaissance, but hardly as a decisive weapon. Within a few months, however, this view changed fundamentally. World War I became the first major conflict in which aircraft were used systematically, and it showed that aviation could be not only a symbol of progress, but also a tool of destruction. At the beginning of the war, the armies of Europe used aircraft primarily for reconnaissance. Balloons and airships had already been used for this purpose before, but motorized aircraft proved to be more flexible and less vulnerable. Pilots flew over enemy lines, mapped positions, photographed trenches, and reported troop movements. This information was invaluable for strategic planning, and it soon became clear that control of airspace could have a decisive impact on warfare. But reconnaissance alone did not remain the only area of application for long. Soon the first dogfights occurred when opposing pilots tried to prevent each other from working. Initially, they shot at each other with pistols or rifles, but this improvised method soon led to the development of machine guns that were built directly into the aircraft. A decisive technical innovation was the so-called breaker gear, which made it possible to shoot through the propeller circuit without destroying one's own rotor blades. With this invention, the aeroplane turned into a real weapon, and air combat became a theater of war in its own right. A new form of hero image emerged: the fighter pilot. Men like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron from Germany, or René Fonck from France became legends whose duels in the sky represented a mixture of chivalry and modern technology. They were considered the new knights of the industrial age, who fought in their colorful machines above the trenches, while millions of soldiers remained in trench warfare below. Compared to the gruesome reality on the ground, the air war offered a seemingly clean, almost romantic stage, even if the fighting was just as deadly. In addition to fighter planes, bombers soon also played a growing role. In the beginning, hand grenades or small bombs were dropped by hand over enemy positions, but soon aircraft were constructed that could carry larger loads. They attacked train stations, supply routes, and factories, and for the first time in history, cities were also bombed from the air. Although the damage was still comparatively small, the symbolic effect was enormous. The war was no longer limited to the front, but also reached home. This was a premonition of what was to become a terrible reality in World War II. Airships also played a special role, especially the German Zeppelins. They were used for reconnaissance missions, but also for attacks on British cities. In 1915 and 1916, Zeppelins bombed London, terrifying the population. Even if the military effect remained limited, the airships were cumbersome, susceptible to defensive fire and weather conditions. It became clear that the war had now reached a new dimension. The sky was no longer neutral, but a battlefield itself. The technical developments during the war were rapid. Aircraft that barely reached 100 km per hour in 1914 flew twice as fast in 1918 and were equipped with more powerful engines and better weapons. New types of aircraft emerged: light fighters, heavy bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, two-seaters with gun emplacements. The tactics also developed quickly. Formations, squadron formations, and strategic concepts for air warfare emerged. The First World War was thus a kind of laboratory in which experience was gained in a very short time and translated into technical advances. Aviation changed not only warfare, but also people's perceptions. Newspapers reported extensively on flying aces whose faces were printed on postcards. They became national heroes, whose fame was to outshine the horrors of trench warfare. At the same time, the population began to understand that no city was completely safe anymore. The sky, which had previously symbolized freedom and progress, now became a possible threat space. For the pilots, the war was a mixture of adventure and nightmare. Many volunteered because they wanted to escape the cruel trench warfare and found flying to be cleaner and more noble. But the loss rates were high, and the average life expectancy of a new fighter pilot was often only a few weeks. The romanticization of air combat belied the brutal reality that blood, death, and destruction reigned here as well. At the end of the war, aviation was completely different from what it was at the beginning. The improvised reconnaissance aircraft of 1914 had become highly specialized aircraft that were indispensable in many areas of the war. The conflict had shown that no modern army could do without air forces. At the same time, however, he had also made the dangers of the new technology clear. From then on, the sky was a space of destruction, not just of dreams. The aftermath of the First World War on aviation was enormous. Many of the technical developments were incorporated into civil aviation after 1918. Engines, propellers, and construction methods developed during the war formed the basis for the aircraft of the 1920s. The experience with logistics, organization, and maintenance of aircraft also promoted the development of civil airlines. At the same time, the memory of the bombing raids and dogfights remained a reminder of how quickly progress could turn into destruction. In retrospect, it is clear that the First World War marked the final breakthrough of aviation. While balloons and zeppelins revealed their limits, the motorized aircraft prevailed as the decisive aircraft of the future. The war transformed aviation from a testing ground for adventurers into an indispensable element of modern states. The Wright brothers had shown that flying was possible. The First World War proved that flying could decide on war and peace. Chapter 10: Interwar Period, Golden Era of Aviation and First Airlines. When the First World War ended in 1918, the world was marked by destruction and death. But at the same time, the war had produced a wealth of technical innovations that had taken aviation to a whole new level. Airplanes were no longer fragile, experimental machines that could only fly for a few minutes. They had become robust, powerful, and maneuverable devices that had been produced and used in large numbers. These developments were now, in peace, to usher in a new era, the interwar period, which is often referred to today as the golden era of aviation. During this time, aviation changed from a military instrument to a central component of civil society. War machines became passenger planes, military pilots became pioneers of commercial flying, and the sky as a battlefield became the sky as a traffic area. At the same time, this era was marked by a romantic spirit in which daring pilots set records, tried new routes, and made the sky the scene of spectacular adventures. A central phenomenon of this time was the emergence of the first airlines. It had already become clear during the war that aeroplanes could transport people and mail over longer distances. After the armistice, companies sprang up all over Europe and North America to put this idea into practice. In Germany, Lufthansa was founded in 1926. In France, Air France was created from mergers of various smaller companies, and in Great Britain, Imperial Airways developed, which was to connect the empire with scheduled flights. Airlines such as Pan American Airways also emerged in the USA, which soon began long-haul flights from North America to the Caribbean and South America. The planes of that time were still small, often converted military aircraft that could accommodate few passengers. But they symbolized progress and speed. Mail flights became an important business area because they enabled fast communication between cities and countries. Transporting letters over hundreds of kilometers in a few hours was a sensation that changed the everyday lives of many people. Soon, airlines also began to carry passengers, first wealthy businessmen and adventurers, later a growing middle class. At the same time, a culture of records and spectacular flights developed. Pilots became icons of a new era. Charles Lindbergh succeeded in 1927 in the first solo crossing of the Atlantic without a stopover. His flight from New York to Paris in the Spirit of St. Louis made him world famous overnight and showed that aeroplanes could connect continents. In Europe, Louis Blériot had already been celebrated for his canal crossing, but Lindbergh's performance set a new standard. Women also played a prominent role in this era. Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1932, and she campaigned for equality in aviation. Their flights inspired millions of people and showed that flying was not just a male domain. Earhart disappeared without a trace in 1937 during an attempt to circumnavigate the world, a tragic end that finally made her a legend. The interwar period was not only a time of records, but also of technical refinement. Aircraft became more reliable, more powerful, and more comfortable. While the early machines still had open cockpits and loud engines, aircraft with closed cabins, heating, and comfortable seats were now being created. The comfort was still far from what was later taken for granted, but compared to the adventurous flights of the pioneers, it was a huge step forward. In addition to civil aviation, military aviation also continued to develop. The experience of the First World War had shown that aircraft could be decisive, and many states invested heavily in their air forces. Italy under Mussolini, Germany in the Weimar Republic, and later in the Third Reich Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union expanded their air forces. New types of aircraft such as fighters, bombers, and transport aircraft were tested, and air maneuvers became part of military doctrine. At the same time, aviation became an important propaganda tool. Flights over long distances were intended to demonstrate national strength, and air shows attracted hundreds of thousands of spectators. In Germany, for example, the Zeppelin Graf Zeppelin became a symbol of technical superiority when it undertook a circumnavigation of the world in 1929. In the USA, too, enthusiasm for large airships such as the Akron and Macon was great, even if tragic accidents limited her career. Aviation also shaped the culture of the time. Films showed daring pilots, magazines enthusiastically reported on new records, and flying appeared in literature as a metaphor for freedom, adventure, and progress. Airplanes became symbols of modernity, comparable to automobiles and ocean liners. Anyone who flew was part of a new, dynamic world. However, the 1920s and 1930s were also marked by risks and accidents. Many pilots lost their lives in record attempts, and air travel was anything but safe. Technical failures, bad weather, and inadequate navigation facilities have repeatedly led to disasters. Nevertheless, the number of flights increased steadily, and confidence in the technology grew. At the end of the interwar period, aviation was hardly recognizable compared to the beginning of the century. A daring pioneering work had become an established industry, with international airlines, standardized aircraft, and a growing infrastructure of airports, flight schedules, and navigation systems. Heaven was no longer an unattainable dream, but a space that was used regularly and systematically. In retrospect, the interwar period is considered the golden era of aviation because it was characterized by a unique mix of adventure, glamour, and progress. Airplanes were not yet commonplace, but spectacular, and every new route, every record was a sensation. At the same time, this period laid the foundations for what was to follow: mass air traffic, military dominance in the Second World War, and the globalization of the world through flight. The fascination of this era lies in its pioneering romanticism. Pilots were adventurers, aeroplanes were technical marvels, and flying itself was a symbol of a better future. The fact that a new world war would break out only a few years later and that aviation would once again become an instrument of destruction was still in the future. In the 1920s and early 1930s, however, the skies were full of promise, and humanity believed that by flying, it had found its way into a new, brilliant era. Chapter 11. The Second World War, Technology, Destruction, and Innovation. By the time World War II began in 1939, aviation had already become an integral part of society, the economy, and the military. The experience of World War I had highlighted the role of aircraft in war, and by the interwar period, all major nations had systematically expanded their air forces. But what initially consisted mainly of further developed double-deckers was to change radically within 6 years. The Second World War became not only a global conflict, but also a huge laboratory for aeronautical engineering. It brought tremendous destruction to cities and people, but at the same time led to technical innovations that still shape the foundations of modern aviation today. The first months of the war already showed how decisive aircraft could be for the course of military operations. The German invasion of Poland in September 1939 was characterized by the so-called blitzkrieg tactic, in which tanks, infantry, and air forces worked closely together. German dive bombers of the type Junkers Ju-87, the notorious Stukas, deliberately attacked train stations, bridges, and troop movements, causing confusion among the enemy. This close integration of ground and air forces was new and made the German Air Force one of the most powerful in the world in the first years of the war. The importance of air superiority became particularly clear in the Battle of Britain in the summer and autumn of 1940. After the victory over France, Hitler planned to invade Great Britain, but this first required the elimination of the Royal Air Force. The German Luftwaffe began massive attacks on airfields, radar stations, and cities. For weeks, fierce dogfights raged between German bombers and fighters and British Spitfires and Hurricanes. In the end, the Royal Air Force was able to repel the attacks and stop the German advance. The battle showed that a modern war could not be won without control of the airspace. She also made clear the importance of new technologies such as radar, which gave the British a decisive advantage. The Second World War also brought the massive use of strategic bombing. Cities such as London, Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, and Hiroshima became targets of large-scale air raids. In Europe, the Allies waged systematic bombing campaigns against German industrial centers from 1942 onwards in order to weaken war production and break the morale of the population. Thousands of bombers flew over the Reich night after night and devastated entire neighborhoods. The firestorm in Hamburg in the summer of 1943 or the destruction of Dresden in February 1945 are still synonymous with the horror of air warfare today. In Asia, the Japanese Air Force intervened in the war in 1941 with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of planes destroyed large parts of the US Pacific Fleet, making it clear that planes had also become a crucial weapon for naval powers. Aircraft carriers replaced the classic battleships as the main weapon of the Navy. In battles like Midway in 1942, the new realities became apparent. Planes taking off from carriers decided victory or defeat on the high seas. In addition to these tactical and strategic developments, the war brought enormous technical advances. Aircraft became faster, more heavily armed, and could cover greater distances. Metal constructions finally replaced the old wooden constructions, and powerful engines such as the Rolls-Royce Merlin or the Daimler-Benz DB605 drove fighters and bombers to new heights. Aircraft such as the Supermarine Spitfire, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress or the Mitsubishi A6M0 became icons of a new era of air warfare. The development of jet engines was particularly revolutionary. In Germany, Hans von Ohain, in Great Britain Frank Whittle, worked on the idea of equipping aircraft with jet propulsion. In 1944, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first mass-produced jet aircraft, flew. It was faster than any propeller aircraft of its time and made the vulnerability of the Allied bomber fleets clear. Even though the Me 262 came too late and in too small numbers to change the course of the war, it showed the way to the future. The jet age had begun. Rocket developments were similarly visionary. The German V-2 rocket was the first ballistic missile to enter space, albeit only on suborbital orbits. It was mainly used against London and caused severe damage, but without being decisive for the war. But it laid the foundation for rocket research, which was continued after 1945 in both the USA and the Soviet Union, and finally led to space travel. In addition to technology and strategy, the war also changed the role of pilots. While the First World War focused on individual flying aces, the Second World War was characterized by mass production and industrial warfare. Nevertheless, there were still outstanding personalities such as the German pilot Erich Hartmann, who is considered the most successful fighter pilot in history, or the American bomber commander Curtis LeMay, who organized the devastating attacks on Japanese cities. At the same time, women also came to the fore, for example in the Soviet Union, where female pilots like Marina Ryskova flew combat missions. The war also changed the relationship of the civilian population to aviation. What had been considered a glamorous adventure in the 1920s was now an instrument of fear and destruction. Sirens, air raid shelters, and anti-aircraft guns became part of everyday life in many cities. Millions of people no longer experienced heaven as a promise, but as a threat. This also made the ambivalent nature of aviation clear. It was a symbol of progress and technical mastery, and at the same time a tool that could destroy entire cities. When the war ended in 1945, the world of aviation was different. The jet was born, rocket research had begun, the aircraft carriers had revolutionized naval power, and the strategic bombing war had shown that no city was safe anymore. At the same time, the foundations for post-war civil aviation were laid. Technologies that had been developed during the war found their way into passenger aviation. Many pilots who had been trained in the war later switched to civil aviation and brought their experience to the table. The Second World War had finally put aviation at the center of the modern world. He had shown that no military power could exist without aircraft and that the sky was as much a battlefield as it was a traffic area. It brought destruction on a previously unknown scale, but also laid the foundations for the jet age, space travel, and worldwide networking through aircraft. In retrospect, the Second World War appears to be a dark but decisive chapter in the history of aviation. He showed that technical progress is always ambivalent. What is considered a miracle in peacetime can become a catastrophe in war. At the same time, he proved that the development of flying was unstoppable. The trenches of 1914 had become the jets of 1945, and it was clear that the future of humanity would be inextricably linked to the sky. Chapter 12, Post-War Period and Beginning of the Jet Age. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the world had entered a new era not only politically, but also technologically. Aviation had made a huge leap in these 6 years, from the propeller planes of the pre-war period to the first jet fighters and missiles. Many of the developments that had been accelerated during the war out of necessity were now to form the basis for peaceful use in the post-war period. The sky, which had been a place of destruction during the war, now became a space of new hopes, economic expansion, and global networking. Initially, however, the image of aviation was marked by the war. Europe was in ruins, many airports and factories were destroyed, and planes were no longer needed for attacks but for reconstruction. At the same time, huge quantities of military material were available. Countless machines that had been built during the war could now be converted for civilian purposes. Bombers became cargo planes, transport planes became passenger planes. Especially in the USA, which had a huge aviation industry at the end of the war, the transition to civil aviation began immediately. The post-war period was marked by a deep need for normality, but also for connections across the destroyed borders. Airplanes played a decisive role in this. Suddenly, it was possible to reconnect cities and countries that had previously been separated by war. Airlines began to expand their networks. Pan American Airways from the USA established itself as a worldwide brand, offering flights to Europe, Asia, and South America. In Europe, new national airlines have been created or old ones have been reorganized. British European Airways in the UK, Air France in France, KLM in the Netherlands, and Lufthansa in Germany. While propeller planes still dominated in the first post-war years, a technological revolution was already in the offing: the jet age. The foundations for this had been laid during the war, for example by the German Me-262 or the British Gloucester Meteor. Now these ideas were consistently developed, and soon the first jet aircraft for civil traffic were created. However, before jets conquered aviation, the late 1940s and early 1950s were dominated by large propeller planes. Aircraft such as the Douglas DC-4, the Lockheed Constellation, or the Boeing Stratocruiser made comfortable long-haul flights possible. They had pressurized cabins, which allowed high-altitude flights without oxygen masks, and offered a new way of traveling that exuded luxury and elegance. The sky became a room of glamour. Stewardesses in elegant uniforms, onboard restaurants, and spacious seats made air travel an experience for the wealthy elite. At the same time, states began to organize the sky more politically and economically. The founding of the International Air Transport Association, IATA, in 1945 created the first international structure that regulated flight schedules, tariffs, and safety standards. Airports were modernized, runways were extended to accommodate larger aircraft. Aviation was no longer just a technical adventure, but a global system under construction. But while propeller planes dominated civil aviation, the jet age brought a new dynamic. Militarily, the superpowers immediately relied on jet planes. The Cold War, which developed after 1945, massively advanced aviation. The USA and the Soviet Union engaged in an arms race in the air. Jets such as the American F-86 Sabre or the Soviet MiG-15 became symbols of this conflict. They shaped the Korean War in the early 1950s and made it clear that the time of the propeller fighters was finally over. At the same time, engineers experimented with supersonic speeds. As early as 1947, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier for the first time in a Bell X-1, a symbolic moment that marked the beginning of a new era. The sky was no longer limited by the limits of aerodynamics, but became a testing ground for speeds that previously seemed unthinkable. This had not only military, but also psychological significance. Man had once again broken through a border that had long been considered insurmountable. In the civilian sector, the jet revolution prevailed in the 1950s. The first commercial jet aircraft was the de Havilland Comet from Great Britain, which entered service in 1952. She promised speed and comfort, but several catastrophic crashes due to design flaws set her back. Nevertheless, the way was clear, and soon American manufacturers followed with their own jets. Boeing launched the Boeing 707 in 1958, which became the symbol of the jet age. It marked the beginning of the era of modern international air travel. Atlantic crossings in a few hours, comfortable cabins, and mass transport that made air travel increasingly affordable for broader sections of the population. The jet changed the world at a rapid pace. Suddenly, it was possible to travel from Europe to America in less than half a day. Business people were able to attend appointments on different continents, diplomats could communicate faster, families could reunite more quickly. The world moved closer together, and the aeroplane became a symbol of a new globalization. But the post-war period was not only marked by technical triumphs. The Cold War also brought new dangers. The threat of atomic bombs, which could be transported by plane, shaped the thinking of this era. Bombers such as the American B-52 or the Soviet Tu-95 were an integral part of the nuclear deterrent strategy. Heaven was not only a space of progress, but also a possible starting point for total annihilation. Despite this ambivalence, enthusiasm for civil aviation remained unbroken. Airports became symbols of modernity, pilots became heroic figures, and aeroplanes became technical icons. In the 1950s and 1960s, aviation experienced a phase of unbridled optimism. It was an expression of a future in which the world seemed open, connected, and accessible. In retrospect, the post-war period marks the beginning of the jet age, which still shapes aviation today. The transition from propeller planes to jets was not only a technical development, but a cultural upheaval. It changed the pace of the world, created new global connections, and made flying a central part of modern life. At the same time, this epoch was permeated by the contradictions of the Cold War, which made the sky a space of progress and threat at the same time. This laid the foundation for the next phase of aviation, the age of mass aviation, supersonic dreams, and the growing importance of aircraft in everyday global life. Heaven was no longer the realm of the few pioneers, but increasingly became the common space of mankind. Chapter 13. The Cold War, Arms Race in the Air. After the end of the Second World War, the Cold War marked the beginning of a new epoch in human history, which dominated world politics for over 4 decades. Aviation played a key role in this global conflict. The sky was no longer just a traffic space or the scene of technical records, but a central field of military power projection, deterrence, and technological competition. The two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, fought not only for political zones of influence, but also for supremacy in the air. This resulted in an arms race that led to an explosion of technical innovations and at the same time brought with it the constant threat of total annihilation. One of the central components of this arms race were strategic bombers. The Second World War had already shown the destructive power that large-scale air raids could unleash. With the advent of the nuclear age, bombers took on a whole new dimension. They became carriers of the ultimate weapon. The USA relied on machines such as the Boeing B-29, which had already dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and soon developed the legendary Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. This aircraft became the backbone of the American Air Force from the mid-1950s onwards. With its enormous reach and ability to carry nuclear weapons, it embodied the strategy of massive retaliation. The Soviet Union responded with its own long-range bombers, such as the Tupolev Tu-95, which remained in service for decades because of its characteristic propeller turbines. In addition to the bombers, the development of fighter planes played a decisive role. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 was the first major conflict in which jet fighters clashed en masse. Here the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15 faced each other. These duels marked the beginning of an era in which the speed, maneuverability, and firepower of fighter planes increased at a breathtaking pace. In the decades that followed, both superpowers developed increasingly modern fighters. The USA produced machines such as the F-4 Phantom or later the F-14 Tomcat, while the Soviet Union countered with the MiG-21, the MiG-25, and later the Su-27. Each of these machines was not only a technical device, but a symbol of the military strength and technological advantage of the respective side. However, the Cold War was not only a struggle for aircraft, but also for missiles. With the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, the strategic bomber did not become superfluous, but aviation took on a new dimension. Missiles could bring nuclear weapons to their targets faster and more directly, but aircraft remained more flexible and symbolic. In addition, hybrid concepts such as air-launched missiles that could be launched from bombers emerged. The arsenal of the superpowers became so unmanageable that a new doctrine developed: mutually assured destruction. The sky was no longer just a place of mobility, but a permanent arena of the nuclear threat. In addition to military aviation, reconnaissance also played a central role. Information about the strength and position of the enemy was crucial, and so specialized spy planes were created. The American Lockheed U-2, a high-flyer that could take photos of Soviet installations at high altitudes, became famous. In 1960, however, a U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union, and pilot Francis Gary Powers was taken prisoner. The incident triggered an international crisis and showed how dangerous the game in the airspace had become. In the 1960s, the US went one step further and developed the State Route 71 Blackbird, a reconnaissance aircraft that was faster than any interceptor aircraft of its time at over Mach 3. It became an icon of the Cold War and a symbol of technical superiority. Civil aviation was also not unaffected by the Cold War. Airplanes became symbols not only of freedom, but also of bloc confrontation. While Western airlines such as Pan Am and Lufthansa opened up the skies with jets such as the Boeing 707 or the DC-8, the Eastern Bloc countries relied on their own aircraft such as the Tupolev Tu-104 or later the Ilyushin Illinois 62. The Soviet Union wanted to show that it could compete not only militarily, but also civilly. This also resulted in one of the most ambitious projects of the Eastern Bloc, the Tupolev Tu-144, the first supersonic passenger aircraft to fly before the Western Concorde. Even though the Tu-144 soon failed, it remained a symbol of the race of systems in the sky. The arms race in the air was not limited to the superpowers. Other states also invested massively in their air forces. NATO countries coordinated their air armament, while the Warsaw Pact built up a huge fleet of Soviet aircraft. Crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 showed how much the world depended on the balance of air power. A single mistake would have been enough to trigger the global nuclear war. At the same time, the Cold War brought enormous advances in technology and science. Radar, electronic controls, jet engines, and new materials were developed at a breathtaking pace. What originated in the military sector often found its way into civil aviation later. Pressurized cabins, improved navigation systems, or powerful engines are examples of this technological interaction. However, the Cold War was not only an era of threat, but also of fascination. Aircraft such as the State Route 71, the MiG-25, or the Concorde were symbols of a time when the sky became a mirror of geopolitical power. Airshows served as a showcase of strength, and each new model was carefully analyzed by the other side. Espionage, counter-espionage, and technological innovations created a climate of constant tension, but also of progress. In retrospect, it is clear that the Cold War finally made heaven a political space. Airplanes were no longer just means of transport or weapons, but carriers of a message. Whoever ruled the sky also ruled the world. At the same time, this epoch was a paradox. Never before had humanity benefited so much from aviation, never before had it been so threatened by it. The jet and rocket era, which reached its peak in those years, changed not only politics but also people's consciousness. Heaven was no longer a neutral element, it was a place where the fate of the world could be decided. Chapter 14. Civil Aviation in the Jet Age, from the Boeing 707 to the Concorde. At the end of the 1950s, civil aviation entered a new chapter in its history. The transition from propeller planes to jets not only changed the pace of the world, but also the self-image of flying. What had previously been an adventure for the wealthy or businessman now began to become an everyday means of transport. The jet dramatically shortened distances, made the Earth smaller, and connected continents at a speed that was previously unimaginable. At the same time, he shaped a culture of glamour and elegance that made flying a symbol of modernity. The milestone in this development was the Boeing 707, which entered service in 1958. It was the first commercially successful jet aircraft and quickly became the standard for long-haul flights. With a speed of around 900 km per hour and space for more than 150 passengers, it set new standards. Airlines such as Pan Am, TWA, and Lufthansa introduced the aircraft into their fleets, establishing the jet as a new symbol of internationality and progress. Atlantic flights, which had previously taken over 12 hours with propeller planes, could now be completed in less than 8 hours. The introduction of the Boeing 707 marked the beginning of the jet age that dominated civil aviation in the 1960s and 1970s. Shortly thereafter, Douglas launched the DC-8, and other models such as the Boeing 727 or the Caravelle from France soon followed. Each of these machines was faster, more powerful, and more comfortable than its predecessors. With them, the aeroplane finally became the central means of transport in a globalized world. In retrospect, the 1960s are considered the golden era of flying. Traveling by plane was an experience that conveyed elegance, comfort, and a sense of exclusivity. Airlines advertised with spacious seats, onboard restaurants, elegant uniforms of the stewardesses, and a service reminiscent of luxury hotels. Flying was not just a locomotion, but part of a modern way of life that signaled prosperity and sophistication. Airports became cathedrals of modernity, gateways to a new, connected world. But the jet age brought not only comfort, but also new technical challenges. The speed of the jets was higher, airports had to extend their runways, and air traffic increased rapidly. Air traffic control systems were modernized, radar surveillance became standard, and international organizations such as the ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, developed rules for safe global airspace. In addition to the Boeing 707 and its sisters, another aircraft that revolutionized civil aviation appeared on the scene in the late 1960s, the Boeing 747, also known as the jumbo jet. With space for over 400 passengers, it opened up a new dimension of mass transport. For the first time, flying became affordable not only for the upper class, but also for the broad middle class. The jumbo jet democratized travel, and it shaped the image of international aviation for decades. At the same time, a project was created in Europe that embodied the dreams of speed and technical superiority, the Concorde. From the 1960s onwards, France and Great Britain worked together on a supersonic passenger aircraft that would be twice as fast as conventional jets. In 1976, the Concorde began regular service. It flew at Mach 2, i.e. over 2,000 km per hour, and could cover the distance from Paris or London to New York in less than 4 hours. The Concorde was a technical masterpiece that catapulted flying into a whole new dimension. But despite its prestige, the Concorde remained an exclusive niche product. Its operating costs were enormous, it could only carry a few passengers, and ticket prices were correspondingly high. In addition, the noise of the supersonic flights, especially during takeoff and the sonic boom, was a major problem that limited their use to certain routes. Nevertheless, the Concorde embodied the dream of a future in which speed would know no bounds. It became a symbol of progress, even if it could never compete economically with the big jets. The jet age also gave rise to new geopolitical rivalries. The Soviet Union wanted to create its own supersonic aircraft, the Tupolev Tu-144, which would compete with the Concorde. In fact, the Tu-144 was in the air even earlier than the Concorde in 1968, but it suffered from technical problems, accidents, and a lack of economy. It remained a prestige project that was soon discontinued, but it showed how much aviation was also an instrument of the Cold War. In addition to speed and capacity, safety also played an increasingly important role. With the increase in air traffic, the risk of accidents increased, and spectacular disasters shaped the public's perception. Each crash became known worldwide, and it led to discussions about technology, maintenance, and training. But overall, jet aviation proved to be remarkably safe, and the accident rate fell steadily as more experience was gained. In the 1970s, the political dimension of aviation also began to become more prominent. Airplane hijackings and terrorist attacks, such as the hijacking of the Lufthansa plane Landshut in 1977, made it clear that aeroplanes were not only technical but also political symbols. The sky was not only a traffic area, but also a scene of geopolitical conflicts. Despite all the problems, the period from the Boeing 707 to the Concorde remains an era of new beginnings and fascination. Never before had humanity been able to travel so quickly, so comfortably, and so globally. Airplanes became symbols of a new world order in which continents had moved closer together. They shaped everyday life, the economy, and culture. Films such as airport or advertising campaigns by major airlines made flying a myth of the modern age. In retrospect, this phase marks the peak of optimism in aviation. The jet was the promise of a borderless future in which distances disappeared and the world could become one big community. The Boeing 707 brought speed and range, the Boeing 747 brought mass and affordability, and the Concorde brought prestige and speed beyond previous imagination. Together, they created an image of flying that continues to have an impact today, as a symbol of freedom, progress, and globality. Chapter 15. Space and Overlaps with Aeronautics. By the time humanity began to leave the skies for good and venture into space in the mid-20th century, aviation was already a firmly established part of modern life. Airplanes had reduced the size of the globe, connecting continents in hours and turning the Earth into a network that opened up from the air. But the advances in aviation had also raised a new question. If it was possible to fly faster than sound, why shouldn't it be possible to break through the atmosphere altogether? Space travel was the logical continuation of the centuries-old dream of flying, an expansion of human horizons beyond the limits of the Earth. The overlaps between aviation and space travel are manifold. The development of jet engines during the Second World War, the birth of rocket research and the construction of high-speed aircraft laid the foundations for later space programs. The German V-2 rocket, which was used during the war, was both a lethal weapon and the forerunner of the launchers that would later carry satellites and people into space. After the end of the war, both the USA and the Soviet Union brought German engineers such as Wernher von Braun to their countries, where they became key figures in early space travel. The Cold War gave space travel a political and ideological framework that closely linked it to aviation. Both superpowers wanted to prove that they could achieve not only air supremacy, but also spatial sovereignty. Aviation had been the first battlefield of this competition. Space travel became the next arena. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into space in 1957, it was a shock for the Western world. Suddenly, it became clear that rockets that could carry satellites into space could also carry nuclear warheads across continents. The boundary between civilian and military applications was fluid. The United States responded with a massive expansion of its space program. NASA, founded in 1958, combined civilian and military interests and used a wealth of aviation experience. Test pilots who had previously flown supersonic aircraft such as the Bell X-1 or the X-15 were now trained to become astronauts. This is one of the clearest connections between aviation and space travel. The pioneers who went to the limits of the atmosphere paved the way for those who were to cross them. The X-15 is a good example of this transitional phase. This rocket plane, which was tested in the 1960s, reached altitudes of over 100 kilometers and speeds of Mach 6. It was still formally an aircraft that was launched from a carrier aircraft and had wings, but it broke the boundaries of space travel. Much of the knowledge gained with the X-15, such as aerodynamics at extreme speeds and heat protection systems, flowed directly into the development of space capsules and later the space shuttle. The training of astronauts also showed the close connection. Almost all early astronauts were pilots, men who had learned to master machines in extreme conditions, to make quick decisions and to remain calm in dangerous situations. The Mercury 7, the first group of astronauts in the USA, consisted exclusively of test pilots. In the Soviet Union, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, was also a trained military pilot. Space travel was therefore inconceivable without the heritage and capabilities of aviation. Technically, there were also overlaps. Materials developed for high-performance aircraft were used in rockets and space capsules. Navigation systems that had been tested in aviation were adapted for space. The development of pressurized cabins, life support systems and communication methods also had their roots in aviation. The aeroplane was the school where humanity learned what it meant to move in a hostile space, knowledge that then became indispensable for space. Space travel, in turn, influenced aviation back. Technologies developed for rockets found their way into aircraft. Lightweight construction, new composite materials, electronic controls, all of this benefited from the huge investments that flowed into the space programs. For example, the development of GPS, which was originally developed for military purposes in the context of satellites, later revolutionized civil aviation, making navigation more precise and safer than ever before. A particularly close connection was created with the Space Shuttle, which was used in the USA from the early 1980s. It was half spacecraft, half plane. It took off like a rocket but returned to Earth like a glider. Its re-entry required knowledge of aerodynamics at hypersonic speeds, while its landing on a normal runway required the skill of a pilot. The shuttle pilots were all experienced military or test pilots who had learned their trade in aviation. Aerospace also connected people's imaginations. In the 1960s and 1970s, jets such as the Concorde as well as rockets such as the Saturn V symbolized the vision of a limitless future. Both were expressions of the same belief in progress, that technology could liberate humanity, accelerate it and take it beyond its previous limits. Airplanes connected the Earth, rockets connected the Earth with space. But this euphoria was not without its downsides. The space race was closely linked to military interests. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, spy satellites, and space technologies have always been part of deterrent strategies. The sky above the Earth and space above it became militarily relevant spaces. Here, too, the two-facedness of aviation history was evident. Progress and threat went hand in hand. In the civilian sector, however, the combination of aerospace led to unprecedented globalization. Satellites enabled worldwide communication, weather forecasts, and navigation. Aircraft could rely on these systems, making them safer and more efficient. Passengers indirectly benefited from technologies that were originally intended for space missions. In retrospect, it can be said that aviation and space travel are not separate stories, but chapters of the same book. From the very beginning, the dream of flying was a dream of freedom, of expanding and crossing borders. First man conquered the skies, then he ventured into orbit and finally to the moon. Each of these achievements built on the previous ones. Without the experience of aviation, space travel would not have been possible. Without the impulses of space travel, aviation would not have become so modern so quickly. Chapter 15 therefore shows that aviation cannot be considered in isolation. It is part of a larger human adventure, the conquest of spaces that have long seemed inaccessible. Heaven and the universe are two rungs of the same ladder, and the path that humanity has walked on them is far from over. Chapter 16. The rise of low-cost airlines and the democratization of flying. Until well into the second half of the 20th century, flying was a special event for most people, an experience that was associated with luxury, elegance, and a touch of exclusivity. Although the large jets such as the Boeing 747 had expanded capacity and reduced costs, air travel remained a pleasure for a long time, which mainly wealthy citizens and business travelers could afford. It was not until the rise of low-cost airlines from the 1970s and 1980s onwards that a fundamental change began, democratizing flying and making it an everyday means of transport for broad sections of the population. This development changed not only the aviation industry, but also the travel behavior, the economy, and the cultural self-image of the globalized society. The origins of the low-cost model lie in the United States. There, the Airline Deregulation Act came into force in 1978, liberalizing air traffic, which had been heavily regulated until then. Airlines could now set their own prices and open new routes without having to seek government approval. This new freedom was used by entrepreneurs such as Herb Kelleher, who founded Southwest Airlines in 1971. Southwest relied on a simple, efficient model: flights without unnecessary luxury, short turnaround times on the ground, a unified fleet of Boeing 737s to reduce costs, and a point-to-point system instead of the traditional hub-and-spoke network. Passengers did without onboard catering and free choice of seats, but received significantly lower ticket prices. Southwest became a pioneer and role model for numerous low-cost airlines worldwide. In Europe, it took a little longer for the model to catch on. It was not until the 1990s, when the European Union created the single market for air transport, that the space for low-cost airlines emerged. Ryanair from Ireland and EasyJet from Great Britain were the pioneers. Ryanair originally started as a small regional airline, but then followed the example of Southwest and transformed into an aggressively growing low-cost airline. EasyJet followed a similar course and also relied on low prices, lean processes, and a young fleet. The business model was simple but radical. No free meals, no seat reservations, no luxury services. Instead, costs were kept to a minimum, and the amounts saved were passed on to customers in the form of low prices. Ryanair introduced additional fees, for example for baggage or in-flight catering, and earned additional money in the process. At the same time, airlines used smaller, cheaper airports away from metropolises, which were often willing to grant subsidies or favorable conditions to attract the new traffic. The impact of this model was enormous. Suddenly, flying was no longer a rare privilege, but affordable for many people. A ticket from London to Barcelona could often cost less than a train journey within the UK. Families could spend their holidays in Spain or Italy. Young people could take weekend trips to Prague, Berlin, or Amsterdam. Business travelers could spontaneously attend appointments throughout Europe. The aeroplane became a means of transport like the bus or the train, fast, cheap, and available to everyone. This change had profound social consequences. Tourism was democratized, and entire regions experienced an upswing because they were suddenly accessible by cheap flight. Cities such as Krakow, Porto, or Dubrovnik, which had previously been accessible with difficulty or high costs, became popular destinations for city trips. Airports that were once in a deep sleep have become hubs for low-cost air traffic. At the same time, people's travel behavior changed. Instead of one big holiday a year, several short trips became common. Flying became a matter of course, almost banal. The low-cost airlines also changed the industry economically. Traditional airlines came under pressure to lower their prices or set up their own low-cost offshoots. This is how airlines such as Germanwings, Transavia, or BA's Go were created, which tried to keep up with the newcomers. However, many of these attempts were unsuccessful, as the structures of the major airlines were often too cumbersome to keep up with the radical efficiency of the low-cost airlines. However, the low-cost airlines were not just a European or American phenomenon. Similar models have also emerged in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. AirAsia in Malaysia became one of Asia's largest low-cost carriers, with GOL in Brazil and Mango in South Africa following similar strategies. Everywhere, the low-cost airlines ensured that the aeroplane became a means of mass transport and millions of people gained access to mobility that had previously been denied them. Of course, the democratization of flying was not without criticism. Environmental problems increasingly came into focus, as the rapid growth in air traffic led to significant co-emissions. In addition, price competition often led to discussions about working conditions, wages, and the pressure on flying personnel. The experience of flying itself also changed. While the golden era of the 1960s was still characterized by glamour, flying now became a sober transport process, often associated with cramped seats, extra fees, and long lines. Nevertheless, the influence of low-cost airlines remains revolutionary. They have fundamentally changed aviation and made flying the norm for billions of people. While a flight to Rome or Athens used to be a rarity, it is now part of everyday life for many. Aircraft have thus finally stepped out of the realm of exclusivity and entered the realm of everyday mobility. In retrospect, it can be seen that the rise of low-cost airlines meant not only a change in prices, but also a change in mentality. Flying has been demystified. It was no longer an experience full of rituals, but a practical way to get from A to B. The democratization of flying has brought the world closer together, facilitated the exchange of people, cultures, and ideas, and decisively accelerated globalization. Thus, this chapter marks another major turning point in the history of aviation. After the balloon pioneers, the Zeppelins, the motorplanes, and the jets, it was now the cheap flight that changed the sky. He did this not through technical innovation, but through a new business model, and yet his impact was just as profound as the great technical revolutions before it. Chapter 17: Safety and Disasters, Lessons from Disasters. The history of aviation is a history full of visions, technical triumphs, and social upheavals, but it is also marked by tragedies. Every advance was accompanied by setbacks, every breakthrough by disasters that questioned the belief in the safety of flying. Nevertheless, developments over more than a century show that it was precisely the accidents that made a decisive contribution to making aviation safer. Lessons have been learned from each accident, resulting in new technologies, stricter regulations, and improved processes. So flying gradually became what it is today, one of the safest forms of travel ever. Even in the early days of aviation, accidents were inevitable. The Wright brothers found that their machines were unstable and difficult to control, and many of their successors failed in attempts to push the boundaries of technology. In the pioneering years, every flight was considered a risk, and crashes were almost commonplace. But even then, a principle began to emerge that still applies today. Every accident is not only a tragedy, but also a source of knowledge. Engineers examined wrecks, looked for design flaws, and adapted their designs. With the rise of commercial aviation in the 1920s and 1930s, safety became more of a focus. Airlines and manufacturers were under pressure to gain the trust of passengers. Disasters such as the crash of the Hindenburg in 1937, which abruptly ended the age of airships, made it clear how crucial the reputation of safety was. The transition from hydrogen-filled airships to aircraft with modern engines was not only a technical decision, but also a safety-related one. After the Second World War, with the rapid increase in air traffic, the number of accidents also increased. The introduction of the first jets in particular brought new problems. The de Havilland comet, the first commercial jet aircraft, suffered several catastrophic crashes in the early 1950s. It was only after long investigations that it turned out that it was due to metal fatigue around the windows, a phenomenon that had been poorly understood until then. As a result, designers around the world rethought the structure of their aircraft, improved materials, and planned safety reserves. The comet tragedy laid the foundation for the reliability of modern jets. Spectacular catastrophes also shaped the consciousness. The collision of two Boeing 747s on Tenerife in 1977 is still considered the worst aircraft accident without terrorist influence. Over 580 people lost their lives when thick fog, unclear communication, and human error came together. This incident led to a revolution in the cockpit. Standardized language rules, clear procedures, and a new understanding of teamwork, so-called crew resource management, were introduced. Pilots were no longer seen as untouchable lone wolves, but as part of a team in which communication and mutual control are vital. The 1980s and 1990s brought further disasters that led to change. The crash of a DC-10 near Chicago in 1979 made it clear how important it is to strictly adhere to maintenance procedures and to take technical instructions from the manufacturers seriously. The United Airlines Flight 232 accident in 1989, in which a DC-10 lost all of its hydraulics after an engine failure, showed the limits of redundancy systems. Nevertheless, the crew managed to make an emergency landing with a minimum of control options, and hundreds of passengers survived. The incident became a lesson in how training and improvisation can save lives. Terrorist attacks and sabotage changed the security culture in a different way. The 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, which killed 270 people, led to new measures in the area of baggage screening and international counter-terrorism cooperation. Finally, the attacks of September 11, 2001 marked a turning point. They made it clear that aeroplanes themselves could be misused as weapons. The consequences were drastic. Cockpit doors were reinforced, security checks were tightened, and the entire airport infrastructure was rebuilt to minimize the risk of kidnappings and attacks. Natural disasters also contributed to safety progress. The eruption of the Icelandic volcano Eyjafjallajökull in 2010 paralyzed European air traffic for days and made it clear how dangerous volcanic ash is for engines. Investigations and new measurement methods have led to aviation being better prepared for such events. Likewise, incidents with bird strikes or weather extremes have repeatedly led to improved materials and processes. The continuous analysis of accidents is now institutionalized. Organizations such as the NTSB in the US or the BFU in Germany investigate each incident meticulously, and their reports feed into international safety standards. Flight recorders, colloquially known as black boxes, provide data that provides information about the last seconds even in the most serious disasters. This transparency, the duty to learn from every mistake, has made aviation safer step by step. At the same time, technology played a decisive role. Modern aircraft have several redundant systems that enable continued flight even in the event of failures of individual components. Engines are so reliable that they can usually still operate safely even if an engine fails. Computer-aided cockpits, fly-by-wire systems, and automatic warnings help to avoid human error or correct it in time. Despite all the progress, however, aviation remains a sensitive field. Every accident attracts worldwide attention, as flying is part of everyday life for millions of people. Passengers' trust is based on the conviction that lessons are learned from mistakes. In this sense, disasters are paradoxically also engines of safety. Without the painful experiences of disasters such as the Comet, Tenerife, or 9/11, aviation would not be as safe as it is today. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the history of aviation is a permanent learning process. Security does not arise by itself, but through the consistent willingness to recognize and eliminate weaknesses. Every accident, as tragic as it is, has made the system more resilient. And so it is precisely the sum of the catastrophes that has made flying one of the safest forms of transport. The lesson of Chapter 17 is that progress and security are inextricably linked. Aviation thrives on innovation, but every innovation must be measured against the standard of safety. It was only through the willingness to learn from mistakes that the dream of flying could be transformed into a reality used by billions of people, with a confidence that was only possible through decades of learning from disasters. Chapter 18. Globalization and Networking, Aviation in the 21st Century. With the beginning of the 21st century, aviation entered an era that was more marked than ever before by globalization and networking. Airplanes were no longer just a technical means of overcoming distances, but an integral part of a global economy that relied on mobility, speed, and constant availability. They enabled the exchange of goods, people, and ideas to an extent that far exceeded the ideas of the pioneers of the 20th century. But this upswing also brought new challenges that still shape the aviation industry today: economic crises, environmental issues, geopolitical tensions, and digitalization. The first years of the new millennium already showed that aviation was at the center of global developments. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 had shaken the industry and fundamentally changed the understanding of security. Airports became high-security zones, new controls and measures made travel more difficult, but at the same time the plane remained indispensable. Despite a short-term slump in passenger numbers, the market recovered quickly because the need for mobility was stronger than fear. Airlines adapted, aircraft were equipped with reinforced cockpit doors and improved communication systems, and international cooperation ensured that safety standards were standardized worldwide. A decisive factor in aviation in the 21st century was advancing globalization. Production chains were spread across the globe. Individual parts were manufactured in Asia, assembled in Europe, and used in America. Without air freight, this just-in-time economy would not have been possible. Aircraft such as the Boeing 747-8F or the Airbus A330F made it possible to transport huge quantities of goods in a very short time. At the same time, the importance of express services such as FedEx, UPS, or DHL, which maintained worldwide networks with their own fleets, grew. Globalization also accelerated expansion in the passenger sector. International networks have been tightened through alliances such as Star Alliance, oneworld, and SkyTeam. These mergers made it possible to coordinate worldwide routes, standardize frequent flyer programs, and seamlessly transfer passengers from one airline to the next. The aeroplane thus finally became the backbone of a world in which travel, trade, and communication no longer knew any borders. At the same time, airports experienced an unprecedented boom. Metropolises such as Dubai, Singapore, or Doha developed gigantic hubs that were not only transit spaces, but became architectural symbols of modernity. These airports were at the same time shopping malls, hotels, and cultural sites. They reflected the importance of aviation as a driver of global tourism, which became one of the largest economic sectors in the 21st century. A decisive technical advance of this time was the development of aircraft that were specially tailored to the requirements of global traffic. The Airbus A380, the world's largest passenger aircraft, was designed to respond to the growing demand for long-haul flights. With space for more than 500 passengers, it was to efficiently connect the major hubs. At the same time, Boeing relied on a different concept with the 787 Dreamliner. Smaller, fuel-efficient jets that enabled direct connections between cities without passengers having to change planes via large hubs. Both concepts reflected different visions, concentrating on a few mega airports or decentralizing through point-to-point connections. Digitalization has also changed aviation. Online booking systems made access to flights easier than ever before, and comparison portals ensured transparent competition. Customers were able to compare prices and book flights worldwide in just a few minutes. At the same time, automation began to take hold. Self-check-in machines, electronic boarding passes, and biometric passport controls accelerated the process at the airport. Digital systems were introduced in the cockpits, making navigation, communication, and flight monitoring more efficient. But globalization also brought its downsides. The rapid growth in air traffic led to rising co-emissions and intensified the discussion about the environmental compatibility of flying. While airlines tried to reduce consumption through more efficient engines, lighter materials, and optimized flight routes, the industry came under increasing pressure from politicians and the public. Movements such as Flygscam in Scandinavia, which called for the abandonment of flights, made it clear that aviation had become a symbol not only of progress, but also of the climate problem. The economic vulnerability of aviation was particularly evident in global crises. The financial crisis of 2008 led to massive slumps in passenger numbers, and many airlines ran into difficulties. But the industry proved to be adaptable. Low-cost airlines continued to expand, while traditional airlines streamlined their structures. Finally, the corona pandemic from 2020 onwards was probably the most serious crisis in the history of aviation. Worldwide, air traffic almost completely collapsed, planes remained on the ground, airports became ghost sites. At the same time, the systemic importance of aviation became apparent, as cargo flights became indispensable for medical supplies and vaccines. After the pandemic, a slow but significant recovery began, and many airlines used the crisis to reposition themselves. In addition to the economy and the environment, geopolitics continued to play a central role. Aviation has always been a mirror of international power relations. Trade conflicts, political sanctions, or wars influenced flight routes, markets, and cooperation. Airspace increasingly became a geopolitical instrument. Closures, diversions, and overflight rights were means of power that had far-reaching consequences for airlines and passengers. Despite all the challenges, aviation remains an indispensable part of globalization in the 21st century. It connects people and markets, it enables cultural exchange and economic integration. The aeroplane has become the everyday tool of a world that is moving ever faster and more closely connected. At the same time, the industry is faced with the task of developing sustainable solutions that meet ecological requirements and can still satisfy the hunger for mobility. In retrospect, it is clear that aviation in the 21st century is a reflection of globalization, full of possibilities, full of contradictions, full of opportunities, and full of challenges. It makes visible how close the world has moved together, how much progress and responsibility must go hand in hand, and how much the sky has become not only a traffic space, but a symbol of our networked present. Chapter 19. Sustainability and Future Technologies, Electric Aircraft and Hydrogen. Aviation has been a symbol of progress since its inception, but in the 21st century it has increasingly become a symbol of one of the greatest challenges of our time, the question of sustainability. While aircraft connect people, cultures, and markets to an unprecedented extent, they are also responsible for a significant share of global co-emissions. Growing awareness of climate change, amplified by political debates, social movements, and international agreements such as the Paris Climate Agreement, has forced the industry to take a close look at new technologies. At the heart of these efforts are electric aircraft, hydrogen propulsion, and a range of other innovative approaches that aim to lead flying towards a more climate-friendly future. Electric aircraft are considered one of the most promising innovations. As early as the 2010s, the first prototypes were developed that could handle short ranges with battery electric drives. Projects such as the Pipistrel Alpha Electro or the eFan from Airbus have shown that electrically powered aircraft are technically feasible. Their greatest strength lies in emission-free use during flight operations. No nitrogen oxides, less noise. They offer an attractive perspective, especially for short-haul routes, such as regional air traffic. But the challenges are considerable. Batteries have a significantly lower energy density than kerosene, which means that electric aircraft can currently only transport short distances and few passengers. While an Airbus A320 can fly several thousand kilometers on kerosene, the current electric prototypes often only manage a few hundred. Nevertheless, engineers around the world are working to make batteries more powerful and lighter. Advances in solid-state technology, fast charging, and the integration of renewable energy into the charging process could lead to electric aircraft becoming a serious alternative in regional transport in the coming decades. At the same time, hydrogen is considered a key technology for the future of aviation. Hydrogen has a high energy density, and its combustion or use in fuel cells does not produce direct co-emissions. Airbus, for example, presented the ZEROE project in 2020, which aims to launch a hydrogen-powered passenger aircraft by 2035. Various concepts are planned, from turboprop aircraft to medium-haul jets to completely new aircraft designs with tanks for liquid hydrogen. Hydrogen offers enormous opportunities, but it is also fraught with difficulties. Liquid hydrogen must be cooled to -253 degrees Celsius, which requires sophisticated storage technologies. The tanks take up more space than conventional kerosene tanks, which makes new aircraft architectures necessary. The infrastructure at airports would also have to be fundamentally rebuilt to enable the safe storage and refueling of hydrogen. Nevertheless, many experts see the greatest potential in this technology to make medium and long-haul transport climate neutral. In addition to electric and hydrogen propulsion, there are other approaches that are intended to make flying more sustainable. Biofuels and synthetic e-fuels obtained from renewable energies can already be used in conventional engines. Numerous airlines have begun to use admixtures of sustainable fuels in their fleets. These solutions are particularly attractive for existing aircraft, as they do not require any fundamental modifications. However, they are currently still expensive and available in limited quantities. The development of a global production infrastructure for sustainable fuels is therefore considered one of the major challenges of the coming decades. Intensive research is also being carried out in the field of aerodynamics and aircraft architecture. New designs such as the blended wing body, in which the fuselage and wings merge seamlessly, could significantly reduce drag and thus reduce energy consumption. Lightweight composite materials, which are already used in the Boeing 787 or the Airbus A350, are a further step in this direction. Even small changes, such as winglets on the wings, have saved millions of tons of fuel in recent decades. Digitalization also contributes to sustainability. The use of artificial intelligence, big data, and precise weather models can optimize flight routes, predict maintenance operations, and avoid unnecessary fuel consumption. Airlines are increasingly using programs that adjust flight schedules in real time to take advantage of favorable wind currents and minimize delays. Air traffic control also plays a role. Shorter approach procedures, more direct routes, and satellite-based navigation help to reduce emissions. All these developments are embedded in a social discourse that is being conducted more and more intensively. Movements such as Fridays for Future or FlyScam have raised awareness of the climate footprint of flying. Politicians are responding with new taxes, subsidies for sustainable technologies, or the promotion of rail transport as an alternative. Airlines, on the other hand, are under pressure to communicate their sustainability strategies offensively, whether through climate compensation programs, investments in new technologies, or partnerships with energy companies. Nevertheless, the central question remains whether aviation can actually become climate neutral in the foreseeable future. Critics emphasize that while technological development is promising, it takes time. Meanwhile, demand for air travel continues to grow worldwide, especially in Asia and Africa. This dynamic could undo progress if a global strategy is not developed at the same time that combines technological innovation, political governance, and societal rethinking. Despite these uncertainties, it can be said that the aviation industry is in a phase of profound transformation. Never before has the pressure to find sustainable solutions been so great, and never before have the technological possibilities been so diverse. Electric aircraft, hydrogen propulsion, sustainable fuels, new designs, and digital optimization are building blocks of a future in which flying should not only be fast and comfortable, but also climate-friendly. In retrospect, one might say that the first decades of the 21st century were the time when the course was set. Aviation has often reinvented itself, from balloons to biplanes, jets and jumbo airlines to low-cost airlines. Now it is once again at a turning point. The dream of flying is alive, but it must be reconciled with responsibility towards the planet. Only if we succeed in combining progress and sustainability can aviation continue to fulfill its role as an engine of globalization and a symbol of human freedom. Chapter 20. Visions of the Future, Autonomous Flight and the Return of Supersonic. If you look at the history of aviation, it is striking that each epoch was marked by a very specific dream. For the pioneers of the 19th century, it was the dream to take off at all. For the engineers of the early 20th century, it was the conquest of speed and height. In the middle of the century, it was the leap into the jet age, while at the end of the century, mass transport and the democratization of flying dominated. Today, in the 21st century, two great visions are at the heart of the debates: autonomous flying and the return of supersonic travel. Both ideas tie in with the long tradition of aviation, which has always been driven by making the seemingly impossible possible. Autonomous flying, i.e. flying without an active pilot in the cockpit, is a vision that seems increasingly realistic in the course of the digitization and automation of many areas of life. Today, modern commercial aircraft are already so highly automated that pilots can hardly control large parts of a flight manually. Takeoff and landing are the phases in which active intervention is still carried out, while large parts of cruising have long since been taken over by the autopilot. Systems such as fly-by-wire, the digital control of aircraft, are standard, and sensors, computers, and redundant systems monitor every aspect of flight operations. So the next step could be to replace the pilot altogether or at least change their role. Autonomous aircraft could theoretically save costs, reduce human error, and increase the efficiency of air transport. Drones, which are already in use for military and civilian purposes, show that remote-controlled or autonomous flying is technically feasible. Urban air mobility, i.e. air taxis for inner-city traffic, is also based almost exclusively on autonomous concepts. Companies such as Airbus, Boeing, but also startups from the tech industry are working on prototypes of such systems. But the challenges are considerable. On the one hand, there are technical hurdles. The systems must be absolutely reliable, as errors will have catastrophic consequences. Redundancy, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity are crucial factors. On the other hand, psychological and social aspects play a major role. Many passengers might have great reservations about boarding a plane without a pilot. For many people, the pilot embodies safety, responsibility, and control. His absence could undermine trust. For this reason, many experts assume that autonomous systems will initially be used as a supplement, for example, to support pilots, to control cargo flights, or for short distances in unmanned air taxis. Only when these concepts have proven themselves could a complete transition take place. At the same time, the idea of supersonic flight is experiencing a renaissance. After the Concorde was decommissioned in 2003 for economic and ecological reasons, the chapter on supersonic in the civilian sector seemed to be over for the time being. But in recent years, new initiatives have emerged that aim to revive the dream of ultra-fast flights. Companies such as Boom Supersonic or Ariane Supersonic are working on aircraft that will transport passengers across oceans at Mach 1.5 or more. Their goal is to drastically reduce travel times, for example, from New York to London in 3 hours or from Los Angeles to Tokyo in less than 6. The new supersonic projects differ from the Concorde in several ways. First, they rely on more modern materials such as composites, which are lighter and more heat-resistant. Secondly, their engines are to be more efficient and cause less noise. In particular, the sonic boom, which practically excluded the Concorde on overland routes, is to be reduced by new aerodynamics. Third, sustainability plays a greater role. Many concepts are based on the use of sustainable fuels or hybrid propulsion solutions to reduce the ecological footprint. However, the return of supersonic is not only a technical question, but also an economic one. The Concorde failed mainly because it was expensive to operate and could only carry a few passengers. Today, the new companies are trying to develop business models that appeal to larger audiences, not just billionaires or heads of state, but affluent business travelers as well. Whether it succeeds depends on whether ticket prices can fall and whether there is actually demand. Nevertheless, the large number of projects shows that the dream of speed has not disappeared. In addition, there are futuristic visions that go even further. Hypersonic aircraft, which could fly at Mach 5 or more, are the subject of research programs in the United States, China, and Europe. These concepts overlap with military technology, especially hypersonic missiles, and could one day revolutionize civilian transport as well. A flight from Europe to Australia in less than 5 hours would theoretically be possible. But this technology is still in its infancy, and the technical, economic, and ecological hurdles are enormous. In addition to autonomy and supersonic, other visions of the future also play a role. Urban air mobility, i.e. air taxis for local transport, could change the cityscape. Companies such as Volocopter, Lilium, and Joby Aviation are developing small, electrically powered multicopters that can take off and land vertically. They are intended to avoid traffic jams, be emission-free, and transport passengers quickly over short distances. Here, too, the vision is clear. The sky over cities could one day be as busy as the streets below. Another field is space aircraft, which could finally remove the boundary between aviation and space travel. Companies such as SpaceX or Blue Origin have shown that reusable rockets are feasible. Concepts such as suborbital flights for passengers, where you can get from one continent to another in a few minutes, are certainly within the realm of possibility. Even though this is initially only intended for the tourism market, in the long run it could change the way we think about travel. All these visions are an expression of an unbroken dynamic. Aviation has reinvented itself again and again since its inception, and it will continue to do so in the future. Autonomous flying and supersonic are just two facets of a wide range of ideas, ranging from sustainable propulsion systems to new materials and completely new mobility concepts. Looking back on the long history of flying, it becomes clear that every dream, as utopian as it seemed, could eventually become reality. Man wanted to overcome gravity, and he did it. He wanted to fly faster than sound, and he did it. Now he wants planes to fly safely without pilots and to be able to travel around the globe in just a few hours. Whether and when these visions will become reality remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the sky will remain a space of innovation, competition, and dreams in the future. This does not end the journey through the history of aviation, but opens up a new chapter. Autonomy and supersonic are not endpoints, but the next steps on an infinite journey. Because as long as people look at the sky, they will ask themselves how far, how fast, and how freely they can fly, and aviation will try to give an answer to that.